Winter still clung to the hills of Riverbend Township. The frost hadn't lifted from the grass that morning when Morgan Delacroix unlocked the wrought iron gates of Willow Grove Cemetery. The wind carried that damp, hollow silence cemeteries seemed to collect, a quiet you learn to respect over the years. Just after 10 a.m., the bell above the cemetery office door jingled. A man stepped inside, removing his hat with quiet reverence. His clothes were simple, neatly pressed slacks, a navy sweater, and a worn crucifix around his neck. His face was tired, but not from lack of sleep. This was the look of a man who'd been holding vigil for too long. "My name's Carlos," he said, voice gravelly but gentle. "Carlos Rivera." Morgan stood and gestured toward a chair. "Come in, please." Carlos eased down slowly, producing a folded photograph from his pocket. "My father, Diego. He's in hospice now. Doctors say it'll be soon." He tapped the photo once with a calloused finger, as if reminding himself it was real. "We need to prepare." He'd want that. Morgan nodded, listening. This preparation before death, is where some families fall apart. But Carlos seemed different. Calm in a way that wasn't denial, but devotion. "Was he from Riverbend?" Morgan asked, pulling out the maps of available plots. Carlos nodded. "Born here. Lived here. Never once wanted to leave. Even when I moved to Charlotte for work, he stayed. Said the soil here meant something." Morgan offered him a plot under a sycamore tree along the east edge of the cemetery. Quiet, a favorite spot of mourning doves in spring. "That's perfect," Carlos said. He always loved trees. They spent the next half hour going over burial arrangements. Carlos wanted it simple. No extravagant hearse, no choir, just a short prayer service and burial with family. He asked Morgan if it was possible to play a recording of Psalm 91 during the lowering. "He said it every night," Carlos added. "Even on the nights he couldn't remember my name, he still remembered that psalm." Morgan made a note, touched by the weight behind the words. Before leaving, Carlos paused by the door. "Mr. Delacroix, do you believe people know they're about to go?" Morgan considered the question. "Some do. You can see it in their eyes. Like they're already halfway across." Carlos gave a slow, sorrowful nod. "Then I think he already sees it." The door jingled again as he stepped out into the cold. Morgan stood there a moment longer, holding the photo. Diego's face stared back at him, peaceful, worn, wise. A week later, the call came. Diego Rivera had passed during the night, and the rain had already begun to fall. The rain hadn't let up. It wasn't loud or wild, just steady. It dripped from the canopy above in slow, deliberate beats, tapping like a quiet metronome as Morgan stood beside the open grave. The hearse pulled up slowly, tires crunching on the gravel path soaked black with rain. It came to a stop near the path's end, and for a moment, no one moved. Then the doors opened, and the Rivera family stepped out into the light drizzle. Carlos led the way, his shoulders squared but his steps measured. He held a large black umbrella, worn at the tips, and beneath his arm he carried a bundle wrapped in plastic. His sister, Inez, followed close behind, carrying a folded linen cloth. Alma, their mother, was last to exit the car, guided gently by her youngest son, Mateo. Alma's age was beginning to show, her hands shook, her lips slightly parted in a daze, but her eyes were fiercely dry. She wore no veil, no hat, just a navy coat buttoned to the collar and a rosary tied in her fingers. Morgan stepped forward. "We're ready when you are." Carlos gave a respectful nod, then glanced toward the sycamore tree, the family's chosen spot. "It's perfect. Thank you again for making this happen." Morgan simply nodded. These moments weren't about her. The family approached the grave slowly. The casket, simple and elegant in dark walnut, rested on the lowering straps. The wind carried the faint scent of lilies from a small bouquet on the lid, now slightly soaked. There was no crowd, no procession. The priest they'd brought, Father Mooney, was elderly, soft-spoken, and thin as a twig in his soaked overcoat. He stepped forward under his own umbrella, opened a worn book, and offered a brief prayer. "The Lord is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble." Carlos stepped forward and handed Morgan the bundle, an old jacket, wrapped in a clear plastic bag. He wore this the day he found out I got the job out in Oak Bend. Said it was his lucky coat. I want it buried with him. Morgan nodded, accepting the bundle carefully. She handed it off to the groundskeeper, who placed it gently in the casket before closing the lid. Father Mooney pressed play on a small cassette player they brought. It was old, held together by tape at the corners, but the voice that came through was clear. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. The tape hissed faintly in the background, more atmosphere than flaw. The verse echoed softly as rain tapped against umbrellas and the fabric of coats. A crow landed nearby. Its talons clicked against the wet branch of the sycamore. It watched the service in complete silence. When the prayer ended, each family member stepped forward. Alma knelt with difficulty, placed her hand on the casket lid, and whispered something no one else could hear. Inez kissed the wood gently. Mateo tossed in a crumpled paper flower he had made as a boy, white and blue, faded now. One by one, they stepped back. Morgan signaled to the ground's crew, and the lowering began. Carlos didn't move. He stood at the foot of the grave, staring down as the casket sank into the earth. His lips moved silently. A prayer, maybe, or a promise. The casket settled into the bottom of the grave with a soft, muted thud. The first shovelful of dirt hit the lid with a muffled pat. The crow cawed once, and that's when Carlos froze. He leaned forward slightly, tilting his head. "Wait," he said, barely loud enough for anyone but Morgan to hear. She turned to him. "Something wrong?" Carlos didn't answer immediately. He crouched near the grave, the wet soil soaking into the knees of his slacks. He held perfectly still, as though listening. Everyone else stopped too. Grounds crew, family, priest. Even the crow tilted its head curiously. Then Carlos stood. His face was blank, unreadable. "There's something," he said slowly. "A sound." Morgan stepped closer. "What kind of sound?" Carlos looked directly into her eyes, a mixture of disbelief and fear creeping into his voice. "It's humming." The rain filled the silence that followed. "Humming," Inez echoed, uncertain. Carlos nodded. "I swear to God. Like someone humming a tune, real soft. Not from the tape. From down there." Mateo took a few hesitant steps back. Alma clutched her rosary tighter, but said nothing. The groundskeeper looked at Morgan, waiting for her cue. Morgan moved closer to the edge. She didn't expect to hear anything. Of course not. But she listened anyway. Just rain. Just the wind moving through the tree limbs. Just the slow, rhythmic tapping of water dripping off the canopy. But Carlos didn't look convinced. He stared into the grave, not with grief, but with alertness, like someone watching a dark hallway after hearing a floorboard creak. Then he said it again, this time firmer. "He's not alone down there." Everyone went still. The wind shifted. The rain came in sideways for a moment, brushing against Morgan's cheeks. The crow flapped its wings, then took off abruptly, cawing once as it vanished into the trees. Another crow answered in the distance, from deeper within the cemetery. And somewhere, beneath the hush of falling rain, Morgan thought, only for a second, she heard it too. A voice, humming, faint and tuneless. But there. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked soil and something else, something metallic, like rusted iron or old blood. Morgan remained by the grave even after the family had driven off, her arms wrapped tight around herself as if shielding her body from the memory of what she'd just heard. She knelt beside the grave, resting her hand on the damp earth. Her fingers twitched involuntarily. She half expected the soil to move under her touch, to breathe, to push back. The humming had been real. In the whisper, that fragile, nearly inaudible word, "Wait." Morgan's breath fogged in the cool air. Her skin prickled with goosebumps, despite the humidity. "Jake." She called over her shoulder. The young groundskeeper had just been climbing into the maintenance cart. He stopped and turned. "Yeah, bring the probe." Jake froze. For real. Morgan didn't answer. She just stared at the grave. Jake muttered a nervous curse, but obeyed, fetching the long steel probe used to check vault placement or confirm casket position without disturbing the site. He handed it to her with both hands. "You think something's wrong down there?" he asked. Morgan took the rod and walked slowly to the side of the grave. "I just need to be sure." She drove the probe into the earth with deliberate, practiced force. It sank easily at first, gliding past layers of loose, freshly turned soil. She pushed deeper, aiming for the vault. Then, thunk, a hollow sound. Not the concrete vault. Something different, like metal on metal. Jake stiffened beside her. That's not it. Morgan pulled the probe out and inserted it again, this time a few inches to the left. Thunk. Same sound. Vaults didn't make that noise, and they definitely weren't placed that high up. Morgan looked up at Jake, her voice calm but firm. Get me the map. Section C-14. Jake ran. She turned her eyes back to the headstone. It still bore the name Rafael Mendoza, 1963 to 2025. Beloved husband. Devoted father. A laminated photo of the man had been wedged under the fresh bouquet of marigolds. His face was soft, grandfatherly, kind. But what they hid under the soil wasn't Raphael. Jake came running back with the binder of plots. Morgan flipped to the C-14 section. Her finger traced the rows until it stopped. Plot 227, B. Assigned to Victor J. Rivera. Her mouth went dry. But this plot was reassigned last year, Jake said, reading over her shoulder. Rivera's remains were supposed to be exhumed and relocated. Were they? Jake blinked. I don't know. Morgan stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. Give me the reinterment log, and call Gloria at records. Jake hesitated, eyes flicking back to the grave. What if he's still down there? Morgan didn't answer, because she already knew the answer. He was. And whatever they'd buried today, whatever had hummed and whispered from beneath the soil, had been laid to rest on top of him. That night, Morgan returned alone. Something had been gnawing at her all evening. She needed to see it through. She walked through the moonlit rows of graves until she reached plot 227, B. A single candle flickered near the fresh grave, the kind left behind by families who believed the soul needed light to find its way home. But this one wasn't lit earlier, and no one had been back since. Morgan crouched beside it. The flame wavered, then surged brighter. The ground gave a soft sigh. And then, just under the surface, where the soil should have been still, she heard breathing. It was a chilly October night in the old town of Brookhaven, a place known for its cobbled streets and abandoned colonial buildings. With Halloween just around the corner, everyone in town seemed to be leaning into the spooky season, except for two teenage friends, Lucas and Jalen, who had grown numb to urban legends and ghost stories. They were metalheads and self-proclaimed skeptics who spent most of their nights driving around in Lucas's rusty Nissan Pathfinder, blasting screamo tracks and chasing the thrill of whatever mischief they could find. That particular night, after hours of aimless cruising and debating which horror movies were overrated, they decided to push their luck and do something legitimately creepy. Lucas brought up an old cemetery he'd seen once while visiting his aunt on the outskirts of town. Officially called Laurel Hill Burial Ground, it was split in two by an overpass built in the 1980s, dividing the ancient graves from the more modern ones. Lucas had always been curious about the older side, untouched, overgrown, and wrapped in a corroded iron fence. By 3:12 a.m., the boys had pulled into a gravel turnout near the woods behind the cemetery. They crept along a side trail, ducked under tree limbs, and eventually reached a narrow break in the fence behind the oldest section. The graves here were worn and crumbling, many of the inscriptions buried beneath moss or cracked beyond recognition. It looked like no one had stepped foot in this place for decades. Laughing and filming with their phones, Lucas and Jalen wandered the rows of forgotten stones, reading what names they could, occasionally making dumb jokes about spirits rising up to scold them. They weren't trying to be disrespectful, at least not intentionally, but they also didn't believe in the stuff they were teasing. They were looking for something weird to happen, something to make the adrenaline kick in. And then they heard it, a laugh. Soft and distinctly childlike, it echoed through the stillness of the cemetery like wind through a keyhole. Lucas paused, thinking it must have been a toy or a sensor-triggered recording left on a child's grave, maybe part of someone's Halloween prank. But when they circled the area, no such grave appeared, and the sound returned. This time, it was unmistakably close, too close. The boys froze. A fog had begun to creep in from the tree line, clinging low to the grass and curling around the headstones. Jalen nervously joked that maybe they'd just stepped into someone's backyard Halloween setup, but neither of them believed it. They were alone. It was only after Lucas looked over his shoulder and caught what he thought was a silhouette crouched near a tree at the far end of the graveyard that his smirk disappeared. He didn't say anything at first, not wanting to freak Jalen out. But when Jalen mentioned seeing someone move in the woods, the air got colder between them. They didn't run right away. Not yet. But they weren't laughing anymore. Lucas and Jalen edged backward, their phones raised like feeble shields, flashlight beams jittering over the gravestones. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it buzzed in their ears. "Let's just head back," Jalen muttered, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked. "We've seen enough." Lucas nodded, swallowing hard. But as they turned toward the broken section of the fence, they realized the trail they came through wasn't there. Or at least, not where it had been. In its place was a dense wall of pine trees, thicker than they remembered, as if the woods had crept in behind them. "What the hell?" Lucas whispered. "Dude, we're not that far from the car," Jalen said, pulling out his phone. He opened his map app, but the dots showing their location spun uselessly in a blank space. That's when the giggle returned. But this time, it wasn't one voice. It was several. Soft, overlapping laughs, like a chorus of children playing just out of sight. The sound circled them, rising and falling from every direction. The boys spun around, trying to find the source. Jalen's light caught something. A small figure, child-sized, darting between two crumbling headstones. He screamed and dropped his phone. Lucas grabbed his arm and pulled him backward, his own light catching another flash, a pair of small, bare feet disappearing behind a tree. "This isn't a prank," Lucas said. "No way someone could move that fast." They tried to find the gap in the fence again, moving through rows of decaying graves. But every direction seemed to curve back to the same twisted trees, the same moss-covered obelisks. It was as if the old section of Laurel Hill had folded in on itself, rearranging around them. The laughter gave way to whispering, not playful now, urgent, insistent. The words were too soft to understand, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, angry. And then they saw it. A grave, half-sunken and smeared with lichen, that hadn't been there before. A fresh bouquet of wildflowers sat atop it, bright and alive, too alive for this place. The stone was smoother than the others, the name carved clearly, Marla Hayward, died 1872. Beneath it, our sweet light, gone too soon. But she is never alone. Before Lucas could speak, Jalen bent over the grave and vomited. His face was pale and dripping with sweat. I felt something," he gasped. "Like something in me. It was cold." Lucas pulled him up. "We have to move. Now." But they weren't alone anymore. Around them, crouched low between the graves, stood 5 figures. Small, childlike, each with impossibly wide grins and pale, glimmering eyes that reflected the flashlight beams without blinking. One of them laughed again, and then they started walking forward in unison. Lucas dragged Jalen backward, half carrying him as the grinning children advanced, step by step. Their laughter had returned, higher now, urgent and excited, like a game reaching its climax. Lucas swept his flashlight wildly, but the beam fractured and sputtered, flickering out as if something unseen had smothered it. The graveyard plunged into darkness. Then came a voice, not a whisper, not laughter. It was a girl's voice, soft and lilting as though carried on the breeze. It spoke a name, Marla. Jalen froze. Lucas turned sharply, eyes wide. The voice hadn't come from the children. It came from behind them. Standing beneath a half-dead yew tree was a girl, no older than 10, wearing a tattered lace dress. Her skin was pale, but her expression was blank, not evil, not kind. Just empty. Her hands hung at her sides, and her bare feet made no sound as she stepped closer to the boys. The other children halted. The girl's eyes flicked toward them, and her mouth barely moved. "You weren't supposed to come back," she said to the others. The figures shivered. One of them began to cry. Not a giggle now, real crying, small and wet and terrified. Lucas realized with a jolt, they're scared of her. The girl turned her gaze on Lucas and Jalen. Her head tilted. "They don't know how to leave," she said. "They stayed too long. They forgot who they were." Jalen clutched Lucas's sleeve. "What's happening?" he whispered. The girl stepped forward. "You don't belong here," she said. Lucas dared to speak. We didn't mean to come. We're sorry. We just... Don't say sorry, she interrupted. Just go. Before it finds you too. What? Lucas asked. Before what finds us? But she was already walking past them. The ghost children shrank back, their eyes dimming, their grins fading. One by one, they turned and ran, melting into the trees, into the tombstones, into the shadows. Then everything changed. The oppressive cold lifted. The forest looked thinner, brighter. Lucas turned and saw the fence, its broken edge exactly where it should be. Their path, clear now, as if it had always been there. The girl stood still by her grave. She looked tired. Lucas met her eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. She said nothing. Then the wind kicked up, and with it came the sound of leaves rustling, no laughter, no whispers, just the breeze. When Lucas looked again, she was gone. Lucas and Jalen never spoke in detail about what happened. Not to anyone. They stopped going to Laurel Hill, stopped filming overnight adventures, and eventually moved out of the town altogether. But a year later, Lucas passed through for a family visit and couldn't help himself. He returned to the cemetery in daylight, walking slowly toward the far end. The grave was still there, Marla Hayward, the bouquet gone, the stone newly cleaned. As Lucas turned to leave, he paused and looked back. There, just behind the tree line, a small girl stood watching him. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. But she didn't vanish either. She only stood there, waiting. And somewhere deeper in the woods, laughter stirred. They say the dead don't speak, but that's a lie. You just have to be somewhere quiet enough to hear them. Marcus Langston hadn't returned to Gallimere in years. The town had nothing for him except faded memories and a sister buried too young. Naomi's death had been ruled an accident, a slip, a fall, but Marcus had read her messages. He'd seen the photos she never sent. He knew she was afraid of something she couldn't name. Her apartment still smelled like her perfume, a lavender trace that hadn't faded with time. But it wasn't the scent that unsettled him. It was the lingering feeling that he wasn't alone, that the space remembered what happened, that it wanted him to remember too. He found Naomi's journal tucked behind a loose panel in the bedroom wall. Its final pages were smeared, torn, and frantic. But one entry stood out in clear, steady handwriting. Just 5 words. Don't go near the grounds. He should have stopped there. Should have packed up her belongings, locked the door, and left the past buried. But Marcus was never good at letting things go, especially not family. The grounds Naomi wrote about were part of an old churchyard outside of town. A cemetery that had been shut down decades ago after a landslide exposed dozens of forgotten graves. No one spoke of it now. No one went near it. But something was pulling Marcus back to it. The next morning, he drove past the warning signs, past the rusted gates and the fallen archway that once read St. Edric's. He stepped onto that soil with his sister's journal in one hand and a voice in the back of his mind whispering a name he didn't recognize. The deeper he walked, the colder the air became. No wind, no birds, just the creaking sound of earth remembering where it buried its secrets. Then he saw it, a grave marker broken in half, covered in moss. But Naomi's name was scratched into the stone, fresh and deliberate. She had never been buried here. So why was her name waiting? Marcus turned to leave, but the path behind him was gone, and the silence finally broke. They say the past dies in silence, but in Gallimere, silence is never quiet. After Naomi's funeral, Marcus lingered in the old house longer than he meant to. Her scent still clung to the furniture. Her notebooks were untouched, some pages marked with trembling red ink. At first, he thought they were poems, but they read more like confessions, or warnings. Something follows me through the trees. It watches from the hedges. I hear it scraping near the roots of the old churchyard. I made a mistake. Marcus had dismissed her unease as paranoia. But the more he read, the more it sounded like a mind trying to make sense of something unnatural. She spoke of the old grounds, not just the cemetery, but something beneath it. Something buried, forgotten by even the oldest in Gallimere. And then there was the name she wrote over and over. Father Belgrave. No one had spoken that name in decades. The cemetery had been sealed after the fire in '84, a fire that started in the chapel and spread to the grounds. Official reports blamed faulty wiring. Locals whispered about something else, that the fire wasn't meant to destroy the church. It was meant to contain what was underneath it. Marcus wanted to know more, so he went to the Gallowmere Historical Archive. Dusty microfilm reels, obituaries with blank spots. Every article about Belgrave seemed redacted, but one page escaped the censors, a photo of the priest, black-eyed and smiling, holding a funeral mass with an unsealed crypt behind him. Marcus took Naomi's old key, the one she always wore on a chain. It didn't match anything in the house. But he remembered, years ago, she used to sneak off and disappear for hours. One afternoon, he followed her and saw her slip through the gap in the iron gate of the abandoned churchyard. Now, he stood at the gate himself. The rusted iron was cold, but the chain was already broken. He stepped inside. No wind, no birds. The graves looked like they hadn't been touched in centuries. But something was wrong. The headstones were all facing the wrong direction, turned away from the chapel, like they feared it. Naomi's key opened the old wooden side door. He expected rot and silence. Instead, he heard something move. In the sanctuary, the pews were still lined up, but melted candles had been recently lit. At the altar, someone had carved symbols into the stone, not words, but grooves, spirals etched by hands too steady to be frightened. Then he saw the journal, Naomi's journal, pages she'd never let him read. There is no God here, only roots, only the mouths of the dead, whispering through soil. He turned. Something scurried across the rafters, human-shaped, crawling like a shadow. Then a voice, familiar. You shouldn't have come here, Marcus. He ran outside, breath ragged, but the graveyard seemed to have changed. The rows of headstones shifted. Some graves looked freshly dug, and on the edge of the grounds, near the chapel's collapsed belfry, was his sister's name, etched into a stone that hadn't been there the day before. Naomi Langston, born 1989, died 2025. Returned. When you bury something long enough, it doesn't rot. It waits. Marcus didn't remember running home. Just the weight of soil in his shoes and the feeling that something had been behind him the whole time, not chasing him, just walking, never stopping. He didn't sleep. He barely blinked. He read every page of Naomi's journal until the words bled into each other. The later entries were erratic, scrawled sideways, as if written in haste or fear. But one thing was clear, she had gone underground. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. There was a tunnel beneath the church, an entrance behind the altar, sealed off by bricks and chained from the inside. Naomi had written about it. They don't stay buried. Belgrave made sure of that. He called it the Root Way, said it connects the graves to the first resting place, said nothing holy grows down there, only what remembers. Marcus went back. Of course he did. The chapel looked unchanged, but the candles were freshly burned down. The air smelled of sulfur and wet stone. He pried open the altar, tore at the loose bricks behind it, and found the passage Naomi had described, a staircase spiraling downward, swallowed in darkness. He should have turned back. Each step cracked like a ribcage beneath his feet. The walls pulsed with moss and old blood. But it wasn't until he reached the bottom that he understood what Naomi had meant by "they don't stay buried." The corridor opened into a chamber of soil and bone. Not graves, mouths. Half-formed skulls embedded in the dirt walls, whispering through unmoving jaws. The sound wasn't words. It was memory. Echoes. He heard Naomi calling his name, not from ahead, but from behind. He turned. There she was, or something wearing her shape. Her skin was pale and soft as wax. Her eyes glowed like open wounds. But the smile that was hers, gentle, familiar, completely wrong. I'm not lost, Marcus. I've just been, remembered. She reached out, and when he pulled back, her arm stretched too far, joints bending like vines, fingers branching like roots. He ran, but the tunnels didn't lead up. They only went deeper. He kept running, kept stumbling, until he found another chamber, this one carved into an ancient tree, roots grown through skulls and caskets alike. In the center stood a figure, black robes, head bowed, and stitched across the chest in rotting thread, Belgrave. Marcus asked what this place was. The figure didn't speak, not aloud. But Marcus heard it anyway. The earth doesn't forget. Only the living do. Belgrave raised his arms, and the ground split open. Coffins tumbled from the walls. Corpses half reborn crawled from the clay, not alive, not dead. Remembered. And one by one, they whispered Marcus's name. He ran again. He doesn't remember how he got out. Just that it was morning when he collapsed outside the chapel gates, mud in his mouth, his sister's journal clutched to his chest. But something followed him. He knows it. Because that night, in the reflection of his bedroom mirror, not the glass, but the darkness behind it, he saw her again. Naomi, smiling. I've seen my fair share of strange things at this cemetery. People whispering to the wind. Fresh graves sunken before their time. A woman who swore her husband's headstone changed inscriptions overnight. You hear enough ghost stories in this line of work, and after a while, they all start to blend together. But I've learned not to dismiss everything. Grief opens doors, some we walk through, and some that walk through us. That's why I keep a routine. Every burial, I walk the perimeter. I check for loose gates, toppled stones, kids sneaking in. Keeps my head clear. Keeps things orderly. That afternoon, we were laying Walter Donnelly to rest. Nothing unusual, simple service, light turnout, soft drizzle. The kind of weather that feels respectful. The kind you barely notice until it's soaked through your sleeves. His family lingered a few minutes after the prayer. Then they filed out quietly, one by one. A few nods. A few grateful smiles. One woman left a photograph on the casket lid. I stayed back, near the maintenance road, watching the hearse pull away. And that's when I saw him. Behind the hedge that runs along the north fence, maybe 20 feet from where I stood. A man. Alone. Perfectly still. He was dressed in black coat, pants, gloves. No umbrella, though the rain had picked up. He didn't flinch or shift his weight. Just stood there, half concealed behind the branches, like he was waiting for the crowd to disappear. He wasn't part of the service. I was sure of that. I had counted the guests myself, 21. This man made 22. But there was something else. Something off. His eyes. Even at that distance, I could see they were fixed on me. Not the grave. Not the family. Me. I raised a hand, out of reflex. Like maybe he was someone I'd forgotten. A groundskeeper. A cousin. Someone with a reason to be there. But he didn't move. Didn't nod. Didn't wave. Just stared. Like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. I told myself I wouldn't go back near Section 3B. I told myself I needed to let it be, that it was just a strange man with bad timing and a worse fashion sense. But something about him didn't feel alive. Something about the way he disappeared, not walked, not ran, just gone, like fog burning off the grass. 2 days passed. I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my chest. Focused on edging the walkway near the chapel and helping a family in Section 2 lay down temporary markers. But every time I turned my back to the hedge line, I felt it. That pressure. Like someone standing just behind you. Breathing slow and steady. Watching. Then the call started. Not to my cell. To the office landline. The one we barely use anymore. First time, it rang once, then silence. Second time, it rang 4 times. I picked up. No voice. Just this soft, wheezing breath. Like someone too old or too sick to speak. I hung up. Told myself it was a prank. Maybe a messed up robocall. But that night, the dreams came again. Same grave. Same man. But this time he wasn't still. He was kneeling, digging with his bare hands. Dirt up to his elbows. And the sound, it wasn't a shovel hitting stone. It was bone breaking. I jolted awake. Sheets soaked. My fingers cramped like I'd been gripping something all night. I checked the time. 3:03 a.m. I got dressed and drove straight to the cemetery. I don't know what I thought I'd find. Closure? Confirmation? Just the truth, whatever it was. The gates were still locked. No signs of disturbance. But when I reached Bridget Harrow's grave, I stopped cold. The grass was dead. Just a perfect rectangle of brown, like it had been scorched from the inside. And on top of the concrete plate, someone, or something, had placed a dead crow. Neatly, like an offering. Its eyes were missing. I turned, instinct telling me to get the hell out of there. And that's when I saw the man again. Not behind the hedge this time. Not across the cemetery. He was right there, standing on the path, 30 feet away, closer than he'd ever been. His eyes were wrong, not hollow, hungry. Like whatever he was, it needed something. Something he hadn't found yet. And then he spoke. First time I'd heard his voice outside the dream. He said, "You're walking in her place." That's it. Just that. Like I'd stolen something that belonged to Bridget. Or maybe I'd taken her spot. I blinked, and he was gone. When I reported it, the director told me I'd been under too much stress, that I should take a week off, go stay with family. I didn't argue. I packed a bag that night, but before I left, I checked the burial registry again. Bridget Harrow, buried 1987. No headstone request, no funeral expenses on file. But one line stood out that I hadn't noticed before. Plot reserved for double interment. I hadn't remembered that. And under reserved name, someone had typed in, redacted, no next of kin, no details, just that word, blacked out. I went back to the grave one last time before I left. I shouldn't have, but I had to see it again, make sure I wasn't losing my mind. And that's when I found the footprints, 2 sets, leading away from the grave, but only one came back, and it wasn't mine. I didn't sleep that week, not really. I'd lie down, close my eyes, and the silence would just throb, like something was pressing in through the walls. Even when I was miles away from the cemetery, I could still feel it, like a string tied around my ribs, pulling me back to that grave. On the 5th night away, I dreamt of her. Not the man, Bridget. I'd never seen her face before, not even in an obituary photo. But in the dream, I knew it was her. Young, mid-20s maybe, in a pale yellow dress, torn at the hem, her hair wet and stuck to her face. She didn't speak. She just stared angry, not at me, but through me, like I was in her way, like I'd taken something. When I woke up, my fingernails were caked with soil. My boots, still in the closet, were wet. I went back. I shouldn't have, but I did. Drove all night. Got to the cemetery just after dawn. Fog rolled low over the lawn, making the stones look like broken teeth. Everything felt slower, like time itself didn't want to move. The grave was open, not a little disturbed. Open. The concrete vault cover was shattered in half, like something had punched through from the inside. There was no coffin, no liner, no remains, just an empty hole and claw marks along the sides, deep and ragged. And near the edge, wedged beneath a clump of roots, I saw it, the name tag from my work vest, the one I lost months ago. I picked it up, turned it over. Someone had carved into the back with something sharp. Not your turn. I dropped it, turned to run, and found him again. The man behind the hedge, closer than ever, arms at his sides, suit stained with soil. And this time, I saw his face clearly. It was my face, rotting, mouth sewn shut, eyes glassy, like a mannequin left out in the rain. He raised one arm, pointed back at the grave, and whispered, "Someone has to lie down." Then he collapsed, right there, folded in half like a puppet with its strings cut. But when I looked down, there was nothing on the grass. No body, no footprints, no sign of anything at all. Just the wind through the hedge, whispering her name. I quit that day, left my key in the drop box, never spoke to the office again. But I still hear her sometimes, in the dirt under my nails, in the hum of my tires on the road. Some graves don't want to be forgotten. Some names don't want to stay buried. And some jobs follow you home.